A very happy new year, a very happy new year to all of you. And let's hope, of course, that we're going to have brighter prospects ahead. My name is John Ward. I'm one of 25 volunteer tour guides at Manchester Art Gallery. And I'm part, of course, of a small team that presents Friends events, generally on the first Wednesday of each month by Zoom. The exhibition that we're going to focus on this evening, which is called Views on a Fortress, will be open until the 27th of February. If you haven't seen it and you're able to see it, do please go and see it. It's been beautifully curated by our own Hannah Williamson. I think many people will know that most of it was actually in London at the National Gallery in the summer. And there the curator was Letizia Treves, but ours is very different. And I'll pick up on some of those differences as we go along. We begin here very much at home because this is ours. Now I'm nobody's, it's one of two interior views that we have of the four works on display. And both the interior views are from Manchester. I'm no one's art historian at all. All I do is I have things pointed out to me and then I make connections, and that's really all I do. And so I have, in the first instance, turned to Letizia Treves, and I found two comments from her especially useful. In fact, I found them liberating. She said, Bellotto, he adopts bold, daring perspectives. And whenever you look at the works, and certainly most of the works we're going to look this evening, you'll see that he's very low. He's almost sort of at ground level. There's no sort of aerial perspective at all from him. And she also says that he tends to foreshorten and therefore sort of manipulate reality. And she says he's an absolute master of bringing certain details forward while pushing others back. In other words, you can sum all that up and say, well, he plays with perspective. And so what do we notice here? Well, there's plenty of grayish blue sky. In fact, I'd venture to suggest that it's perhaps 40 to 45% of this composition that is sky. He also uses, to very great effect, light and shadow. And he has two converging lines. If you look from the right, you see the diagonal line of the barracks. And then from the left, you see a footpath that sharply recedes. And we're invited to imagine where these two lines come together, and they come together in this building, the Brunnenhaus. The Brunnenhaus was scarcely 20 years old when this was painted. And as its name suggests, it housed the well on which the fortress depended. Back in 1563, they'd started sinking a well of more than 150 meters in depth, which basically secured the safety of the fortress, because it meant that however difficult it got outside, there'd always be a water supply. He also uses light and shadow to illustrate a sort of scattered human community. They seem to be doing different things, and we will be looking at these human figures in more depth a little bit later on. But there are two other points here. If you look at these buildings, I'm going to start over on the left. This building on the left is the Commandant's house. That dates from about 1600. I've already mentioned this beautiful building of the Enlightenment, the Brunnenhaus, 20 years old. The barracks here, well, they're in two stages. The lower story dates from the 1590s, the upper story from the very early 1700s. And then in the foreground, there's this rather dilapidated wall, and heaven only knows how old that is. And so what he's done is he's provided us with a cross-section through time. And because we're getting that sense of time, we also get a sense of energy that he's managed to capture. And I'm going to come back to that theme as well. The other thing I'm going to say is that although you can visit the interior of the fortress, and indeed I did do back in November, it doesn't hit you in quite the same way as the painting does. I mean, I've got, sorry, the resolution on that isn't very high. I'm sorry for that, but that is a Brunel house today, looking even whiter than it did back then. But there's something sort of otherworldly. There's something of the imagination here. It's more poetic. And that, I think, is a major contribution, a major achievement of the artist. Now, we're going to begin, as our story really does begin, in Venice. And we're looking here at Giovanni Antonio Canel, who, of course, is known to history as Canaletto, and whose sister was Bellotto's father, hence the uncle and nephew relationship. And when you look at Canaletto's work, he is renowned for capturing architectural splendor, for achieving this sort of epic sense of scale, but at the same time, managing to capture the intricate detail. And most of his paintings, especially those from Venice, are of cities, and mainly, of course, the city of Venice. And this church over here, I've never been to Venice, but this is my favorite church of all the ones that I've seen. It's the Santa Maria della Salute. It was a votive church built in 1630 in thanksgiving for the ending of the plague of that year. And it took 50 years to build. And the way Canaletto has it here, it seems to preside over everything. Nothing escapes its vigilance. And we see all those other features that we recognize in Canaletto's work, the gentle ripples on the water, so gentle that we can see the reflections of the building. And then in front, there's this sort of little theater, expanded theater of humanity. There are two views really on Canaletto. He has his detractors. There are those people who say that his views are too photographic. They're really like postcards, really. They portray a city devoid of energy, even though it wasn't devoid of energy. But there are others who say, no, Canaletto, he was a painter of the Enlightenment. He was the first artist to understand the revolution that Sir Isaac Newton brought to mechanics, to mathematics, and to optics. Speaking for myself, can I say I love Canaletto, not for any of the reasons I've just outlined that have come from other people, but I love the tranquility and I love the peace of mind that I derive from that tranquility. Now we're still in Venice. In fact, we're still on the Grand Canal, but we're looking the other way, and we've got our Santa Maria della Salute again. This time, of course, it's on the right. Because we're looking out into the port, we can see much further, but it has much in common with what we've seen before. But of course, this isn't Canaletto, this is Bellotto, although it is interesting in that for a long time, this was believed to be by Canaletto. But before it came to the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, it had been reattributed to Bellotto. And it does remind us that Bellotto did depend on his uncle for his apprenticeship. All those skills that were part of the landscape artist's toolbox, the abilities to paint, to draw, to make prints, to combine detailed sketches with that forerunner of the camera obscura. All of that he would have derived from Canaletto, and many of his sketches were used in Canaletto's works. Who was the better artist? It's difficult to say. really. Since all the publicity surrounding the present exhibition, I mean, I saw a report in The Guardian saying that Bellotto has been proved to be the superior artist. Bellotto was certainly fortunate. When he was in his teens, he was apprenticed to his uncle. His uncle was at the absolute peak of his powers, so Bellotto was very fortunate in that. But I think it's fair to say that the 1730s for Canaletto was probably as good as it ever got. In 1746, he left for London, where he lived for 9 years. In 1743, Bellotto he's 21. And this, for him, this is just the beginning. And he goes much further afield. He goes elsewhere in northern Italy, and then to Saxony, and then down into Bavaria, and then to Austria, back to Saxony, then across to Poland. And the thing is, we know far more about Bellotto's life than we could ever know about Canaletto. All we know about Canaletto really comes from the letters, the contracts that concern the sale of his paintings. Whereas with Bellotto, I think we do have a much greater impression of a living human being. Now, the invitation comes to Bellotto in 1747 from the Elector of Saxony, and you see him here in this portrait that hangs in the Gemälde Gallery in Dresden. Dresden will be at the center of quite a lot of what we do this evening. And there's a little sort of peculiarity here, because at that time in the 1750s, if you were Elector of Saxony, you were also King of Poland. In fact, his father, Augustus the Strong, had also been King of Poland. So much so, in fact, that he'd changed his religion from Lutheranism to Catholicism so he could become King of Poland. And so, like his father, Frederick Augustus II is a great patron of the arts. He's anxious to have artists at his court, and he sees Bellotto as somebody who would eminently fit the bill. There are other artists at the court, as we'll see in a moment, but Bellotto comes with the promise of a much higher salary than any of the others. Now, I've mentioned Saxony, and of course, not everybody necessarily has a particular sense of geography. Saxony is in the extreme southeast of Germany. I should mention that this is a map of the modern regional state of Saxony. It's one of the 16 Länder that make up the Federal Republic of Germany today. In those days, Saxony was probably twice the size then, but this serves our purpose. And we see its capital there. Over to the left, you see Leipzig, which of course is another major city in Saxony. In terms of the frontier here is with the Czech Republic, or Czechia, as I think we should call it now. And if you follow the river up from Dresden, even though we're going south or southeast, and you'll gradually see there are several bends in the river. When you come to this final pronounced kink in the river, and it's no more than 10 kilometers from the border with the Czech Republic, then that is where the Königstein fortress is. And that the Elbe, as you see, flows further and has its source in the Czech Republic, in Bohemia. Now, Bellotto has one task that he fulfills, and this is the year after his arrival. What he is required to do is to document the prestige of a dynamic city. And he does begin to do that. And there are more, I think Bellotto has more views of Dresden than of just about anywhere else. And most of them, not all of them, can be seen in the Gemälde Gallery in Dresden. We are downstream from the center of Dresden. We have the Augustus Bridge here, and we have the Frauenkirche church here. And both of those had appeared during the reign of Augustus the Strong. They'd been built in his honor, especially the bridge. And I'm going to just move on to the next one, because we see it from above the bridge. And this time, of course, the Frauenkirche is on the left. And we see that the bridge has 12 spans. It's a very bold design. And we also see the church here. I've mentioned that Frederick Augustus II was Roman Catholic, but in that sense, Saxony was very modern. It had a very tolerant climate. There was complete freedom of religion. So you weren't in any way disadvantaged for being Lutheran in a country where the head of state was Roman Catholic. The Frauenkirche had been built, just completed a few years before this, early 1740s, 1743. The dome was unusually high, 96 meters. And the dome itself was made entirely of sandstone, 12,000 tons. It was an engineering marvel. And Bellotto wanted to convey that. He wanted to convey the energy, the innovation of it. But he also wants to do something with the bridge as well. He wants to set the church and the bridge off against one another. And in a way, we can see that his work has taken a different turn from how it was when he was in when he was in Venice. He's no longer capturing just the beauty of the city, he's also capturing something of its energy. Now, in Milan 5 years ago, 2016, nearly 6 years ago, there was an exhibition that linked the two artists, Bellotto and Canaletto. It's called Wonder and Light. And I've got the catalogue. And the catalogue says this: when Canaletto and Bellotto went their separate ways, Canaletto to London and Bellotto to Germany, really their art took different courses. Canaletto's art was always sophisticated, but it was also decorative, and it was always sort of aesthetic. Whereas it said, well, with Bellotto, what he was trying to do was find truth of the mind and truth of material. He wanted to capture things as they really were, not just how they looked. And that's what I think he's trying to do here. He's trying to capture not only the personality of the city, but also of its buildings. Well, this is another view of Dresden. Once again, we have this sort of sense of tranquility. The swans somehow add to that. This is the Zwinger Palace. You get one corner of it here. What I admire particularly about this is the way that he's caught the different textures of the walls of the moat. And again, of course, we have a little, an element of human activity here on the right. Now, as with the capital, so it was with the country, and we find here Bellotto advancing up the river Elbe, yes, towards Königstein, but he stopped off at Pirna. And Pirna, fairly small town on the same side as of the river as Königstein. And above, but not as spectacular as Königstein, you see this fortress, which is Sonnenstein. And if you continue on the right bank of the river, eventually you get into the more mountainous area that we call Saxon Switzerland. Being more accurate to call it the Switzerland of Saxony, really. Saxon Switzerland sounds as though it's somehow part of Switzerland, which it isn't. Okay, so we're further up the river now. And I've got a quotation here from this German novelist, John Paul. He wasn't actually standing at Königstein, where this photograph is taken from. He was actually standing by the Augustus Bridge in Dresden. But what he says here could just as well apply to Königstein. He says, and beside you, the river Elbe flows from one distant realm to another. And if you look up the length of the Elbe, from where it rises in Bohemia to where it flows out at the port of Hamburg, that's 1,100 kilometers. And of course, it does link different territories, as we'll see when we look at another map in a moment. I want you particularly to notice this rock formation here. That's the Lilienstein Rock. And we're going to see that in one of the works, and we'll also see it in a later image. It's almost like a twin brother or sister to the Königstein Rock. Now, this isn't in the exhibition, unfortunately. It was in the London exhibition, but unfortunately, and I can go into reasons later, they're too tedious really to explain now, but we didn't have quite the same deal that the National Gallery was able to have with the National Gallery of Art. So this one went back to Washington after its time in London, but that's no matter. In some ways, I think our exhibition is superior to the London one. We see, first of all, Lilienstein, but there's no river. And that reminds us again that, remember what Letizia Trevors was saying about those bold viewpoints. He's gone very low. He's sacrificed having the river in the painting so that he can accentuate the power and the might of the fortress. Now, he wasn't the first by any means, Bellotto, to capture the Königstein fortress on canvas. Johann Alexander Thiele, who was a fellow court artist and knew Bellotto, and they probably did work together. He'd already captured this rather impressionistic view, but he doesn't do it in the same way as Bellotto. By the way, I should also say that 90 years after this, in 1835, one J.M.W. Turner was in the Elbe Valley with his sketchbook, and he too sketched the Königstein fortress. But he's not the first to capture the fortress, but Bellotto is certainly the first to capture its majesty and its might and its rather intimidating quality. Remember what our friends from Milan said, that he sought material and psychological truth. And when I look at this, I see that he's captured its sort of ruggedness. It's not pretty. I think it's beautiful in its own way. It's not pretty. And it has something of a kind of cobbled together quality. And just as we could with the Brunnenhaus painting, there is a sense in which we look through time because different parts of that fortress have been added. And we'll see this in a minute. So somewhere there will be the medieval beginnings of the fortress back in the 13th century, maybe even before. But here we have the latest improvements going on. So it's a living fortress in many ways. But there's something else in this, and it reveals, I think, something that we've not really seen before in Bellotto. We didn't really see it in Venice, and we perhaps saw it less in Dresden, but we certainly begin to see it here. And that's his feel for nature. And that feel for nature is very often expressed by means of various shades of dark green paint, and dark green increasingly became a favorite color of his. I'm going to zoom in here. So this building here seems to be going on here. You see these men, they're working on a kind of platform. That platform was basically to provide more of a vantage point for, well, I think it was for archery originally, but probably increasingly for rifles, in the event of the fortress falling under attack. In other words, they're enhancing its security. But that's not all there is to it. Look at how the light has picked out the cattle here, particularly the back of this white cow. here. It's almost as though he's drawing our attention to that, and then to these human figures over here. And I want you to notice two things. I want you to notice this dome-shaped tower, which is almost over towards the top right. I know some people will be on small screens, so this isn't easy. And I want you to notice these craggy rocks here below the walls that are at the end of this platform. Because those are those same craggy rocks. And you know, when you look at those, you find that, and I've written somewhere that the walls they're like a living extension of the massive sandstone rock beneath. And it's almost as though you've got these layers of human endeavor that kind of mimic the geological structure beneath. You know, each has almost become the other. Now, you remember the Belltop Tower that I mentioned? Well, there it is again. It's here, and then here, a little further forward, is George's Castle. And when you're looking at George's Castle, you're looking really at the foundation of the fortress. As we've said, the medieval castle had been there for centuries. But in 1589, the foundation stone is laid for the fortress, and the George's Castle is amongst the first of the buildings to go up. If you notice here, there is a tower. Again, we've got the Georgienborg here, dating from about 1600. But to the left, there's a tower with a pointed top, and we see it there. That was an observation tower. It was called the Roschen Tower. It's also believed to have been a dungeon as well. And that reminds us that in its time, amongst many other roles, Königstein has served as a prison. There was no escaping from Königstein, just as there was no getting into it by force. It was known as the Saxon Bastille. And there were some very famous prisoners there, particularly the German playwright of the late 19th, early 20th century, Frank Wedekind. The imperial government in Germany didn't appreciate his freedom of thought, so they put him in Königstein for a few months to try and get him to shake his ideas up a little bit. Now I've got an aerial view here, and what we've been looking at, if you can look, you can see the river, and then you can see the buildings that we've been highlighting, the George's Castle there. And our perspective, really, or the artist's perspective, has been over on this side and over to the river on the left. What we're going to do now is we're going to come round onto this nearest side. We've got the trees in the foreground, and this is really the south wall of the castle. And we see even today, you can see the Brunner House, of course, in the middle of it. Even today, it looks forbidding. There was just no way into it at all. And I've got to, again, the resolution isn't very good on that, but that gives you some idea of what it was like. But to give us the true sense of drama, we need our artist. And this is the view from the southwest. And this is the other view that we do have on display that's on loan. We've got the National Gallery one, and we've got this one from Knowsley Hall, courtesy of its owner, the Earl of Derby. And there's something quite remarkable about this, because he's got the walls sort of dramatically receding there. And we see the depth of the fortress almost in a way that we don't see in any of the others. And yet we don't see very much at all of what is within the fortress. So there are kind of pluses and minuses with this, intentionally, of course. We do see a very clear distinction between the smoothness of the walls and the rugged quality of the rocks, but taken together, they almost look like a cliff face. And once again, we see his sort of opportunity to demonstrate his sensitivity to nature. And we see that even more, I think, in this than in any of the others. And I'm going to take a detail from that. We're going, as I've said, we're going to look at human figures because that has been a particular focus and interest of the exhibition in Manchester. And a little bit later on, we will look at where one of his influences derived from. It's very difficult to read the faces of these people. They look serious. There's almost a look of melancholy, almost despair, I'd say, in the case of this lady on the right. But again, it's a peaceful scene, it's a tranquil scene. There doesn't seem to be any great sense of danger. And yet we do know that a war is coming. A war is coming in that very year. And I'm going to have this up as we pause for the break. So I'm going to hand over to Paul now, who is development manager at Manchester Art Gallery. And Paul, you're going to look for any comments.
I shall. Yes, thank you, John. Hello and Happy New Year, everybody. If you have any questions, do feel free to stick them in the chat box now. We haven't got any questions so far, but there's a couple of comments so far.
Yeah.
Joan commented earlier on when you show the first image that she feels the view looks cold, despite there being figures in the foreground. In whether there's a fortress with it, it looks quite austere. That was an initial impression of the first image that you showed.
Austere?
Yes.
Yeah. Let me just go back to that then. Yes, I think it's possibly to do with the dilapidated wall. And Bellotto, rather like Canaletto, did have quite a fondness for representing imperfections in buildings and in walls. You do see that in some of Canaletto's work as well. And also, I think it might be something to do with the fact that Bellotto, as his career developed, he did have a liking for plainer, almost duller tones. And some people have said, well, this is to do with the fact that he was further north of in Europe. He was very much in Central Europe, whereas previously he'd been in Venice. So yes, I can see that there is perhaps an austere sense there.
There was, sorry, Bridget also made a comment about the work which was formerly attributed to Canaletto.
Yes.
She mentions that the cooler color is a cooler color palette. It's
yes.
a lot of blues and greens and tones.
Yeah.
And with that one as well, I was quite struck by the color of the water. It just seemed really quite beautiful.
Yes. Yes, I think the cooler palette, yes, I can see that now. I think he really developed it when he went elsewhere in Italy and then into Central Europe. But yes, it's a good point. You can perhaps see something of that in this.
And we've had another observation by Carmichael, which was, or a question, in fact, was the bridge and church in Dresden rebuilt after the Second World War, assuming they were destroyed like much of Dresden?
Sorry, Paul, you broke up on that.
Sorry, my internet.
Should I try and...
the question was the bridge and church in Dresden rebuilt after the Second World War, assuming they were destroyed like much of Dresden was?
Yes, they were. I'll say something a little bit more about that as we develop. Yeah, the bridge has actually been rebuilt several times, even before the Second World War. And even as late as 2019, they were working on it again. And that caused them to stop the trams going across it at that time. The Frauenkirche was completely destroyed. And it wasn't rebuilt. I was in Dresden in 1980 when it was part of East Germany. And you could see where the bombers had been even as late as that, 35 years after the dreadful air raids. And of course, the East German government never had any money, really. And so it was only after Germany reunified in 1990 that they thought about rebuilding the Frauenkirche. But it is beautiful. I've visited it several times. And interestingly, the Frauenkirche was where Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, on the 60th anniversary of the raid, apologized for the raid, much to the, controversially so, I'll leave it at that.
I remember, just one final thing from me, John. I'm really enjoying your photographs mixed in with the paintings. It really is, it's really fantastic.
Oh,
but one thing I would like to ask you, you've mentioned that Bellotto's kind of main pursuit is the pursuit of truth in painting to a certain degree. And considering you've been to Königstein yourself to see it, how truthful are those paintings in capturing Königstein, and how have they been captured?
Well, if I just go back to let me just go back to this. It's very difficult to see. It doesn't matter where you stand. It's very difficult to see the fortress in the way that Bellotto did. And the reason for that, well, you can actually really guess at the reason. It's the fact that all the slopes to it are now forested. And so if you have to take, as I had to take, the forest path through, and it's a long climb, it took me nearly an hour, and that's with a walking aid, you don't actually see it until you're almost upon it. And so in a way, I think he intensifies the might of the fortress beyond what would be apparent today. But as we've always said, one of my favorite phrases that I use whenever I'm talking about art is parallel world, that art inhabits a parallel world in which we readily see things that are poetic, things that appeal to our imagination. We readily see irony. And so I think that's what he's doing. And possibly he's wanting also to capture this for his patron, Frederick Augustus II. Presumably he wanted Bellotto to document his realm in a way that would heighten its prestige. It would seem all the grander at a time which was, as we'll see in a moment, proving increasingly dangerous.
Excellent.
Okay. Well, thanks, Paul. The second half is shorter than the first, if I can say that. Two halves should be the same. Anyway, this is, as you see, a map of Europe in 1740. Many people find maps complicated enough. I suppose it's broadly recognizable, but there are some things that are very, very complicated about it, particularly Germany. It reminds us that you could talk about the German language then, you could talk about German literature, German culture, German art then, but you could not talk about Germany as a nation state then. That only comes with reunification in 1871. And so what we see really are these small pieces. And I'm going to concentrate on just three. I'm going to concentrate, first of all, on this darker blue. And you see in the top right, Prussia, Brandenburg. And then rather like bits of a broken plate, these other territories as well. I'm actually going to label all of that as Prussia because that was the term that was in use by that time. Come south of there, we see a kind of dark orange, and that is Saxony, much bigger than Saxony is today. But the most awe-inspiring territory, because there's so much of it, is this territory in the yellow. And it's in the yellow because it's all under the Habsburg monarchy. I'm going to call it Austria because its capital was very much Vienna. But you'll see that Austria is just one of the territories. Hungary, which was a kingdom, Bohemia, which was also a kingdom, Silesia. You'll see that it extends into what is today the state of Baden-Württemberg in Germany, into northwest Italy, and even into what we call today Belgium, but were then the Austrian Netherlands. It was a huge territory. But I want us to focus on Silesia. Now, we've already mentioned one of the European leaders at that time. We're going to meet two more. This is Maria Theresa, and this is Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great of Prussia, Maria Theresa of Austria. They don't have a lot in common, but they do have two things in common because in the year of this map, they both become leaders in their respective realms. It's a coincidence. They're both young. She's 23. Frederick, I think, is 27 or 28. The other thing they have in common is that they both far prefer speaking French to their native German. But they absolutely hate one another. They hate one another in a way that I can't ever remember two leaders ever despising one another. There is a letter, I've heard of a letter where Maria Theresa, she's speaking of Frederick the Great, and she says that he's a monster. Now, she thought she had a good reason for believing that he was a monster. You see this territory, Silesia, is easily the wealthiest in all her empire. But Frederick the Great has designs on it. He presents reasons why it should belong to Prussia and not Austria, and he seizes it. And by the time of 1756, when the two countries go to war again, you see here that Silesia, this very wealthy territory, now part of Poland, has become part of Prussia. Now, she is absolutely determined to get that territory back, and Frederick knows that. He knows that he's not going to be able to live in peace. He knows there will have to be another war. She's already forming alliances with two countries, France and Russia. And her aim, such is her sort of vitriol and hate, not simply to regain Silesia, but to eliminate Prussia as a military power. That's the scale of her ambition. He knows that. He knows that he's going to have to make the first move. And that's why in August 1756, 70,000 troops come over the border from Prussia into Saxony. He says to Saxony, he says, I've no quarrel with you, I'm just passing through. How many countries have said that? You know, as a kind of pretext for occupying another country. I don't think he wanted to take over Saxony particularly. He wanted to go into Bohemia. He wanted to take Prague. And he wanted eventually to line his army up outside the gates of Vienna, not to take Vienna, but simply to prove that he could, to show to Maria Theresa that he was the superior power. Well, you'll know from, of course, any knowledge of any wars, I always think of A Bridge Too Far, the Arnhem campaign in 1944. You know, you can have the best laid plans, but that doesn't determine that you're going to necessarily succeed. And things don't go as he plans. His vanguard reaches Bohemia, it goes along the Elbe Valley, past Königstein and into Bohemia. And he is hopeful of taking Prague by Christmas. That was the aim. But he leaves a smaller army to deal with the Saxon army that has lodged itself not very far from, and we see it again, the Lilienstein outcrop of rock. But he hasn't left enough army, enough men to deal with the Saxons, so he has to come back. And he's seriously delayed. And you could say that that was perhaps one of the reasons why the war wasn't the great overwhelming victory for him that he'd hoped. Watching all this from the Königstein fortress was the elector, Frederick Augustus II. He couldn't do anything about it. He was in perfect safety. There was no getting to him. But Frederick was actually quite magnanimous, really. He said, I promise you, if you surrender, there'll be no recrimination. And he kept his word. Saxon officers were allowed to return home. The ordinary soldiers were allowed either to join his army, which some of them did, or to do what he said they were better at doing than fighting, which was making porcelain, that Saxony was particularly known for, but they shouldn't really fight. Saxony isn't a fighting nation, so Frederick said. And he was very magnanimous to Frederick Augustus the Second of Saxony, let him go to his other realm, to Poland, which wasn't involved in the war. And Frederick has no interest in taking Königstein. And that is what reminds us that Königstein has never fallen in battle. Now, by 1760, Frederick has had quite a few victories, but he's also had a number of defeats. He's had as many defeats as he's had victories. And the war is in a kind of stalemate. It's not going particularly well for him, particularly as he's got to deal with Russia as well. And by this time, Dresden has been liberated by Saxony's ally Austria. And Frederick is determined to get it back. He gets it back, or tries to get it back. He fails, but by launching an extremely lengthy siege, you can see these lines of the cannons, the trajectories of the cannonballs, doing untold damage to the city. Now, if you were in Berlin, which was at the very heart of the Prussian state, and of course is now once again the capital of Germany, you'll find that Frederick the Great is still held in great admiration, really. He's seen as a father of the nation, a great figure of the Enlightenment. I mean, he might have had a ruthlessly efficient army, but equally, he believed passionately in free speech, freedom of thought. He introduced many reforms, complete religious toleration, just as he had in Saxony. If you've been to Berlin, you will have seen this. It's on the Untitled Linden. If you go towards the east from the Brandenburg Gate, you're going down the Untitled Linden, and this is the equestrian statue of Frederick. But you will not find any commemoration of Frederick the Great in Saxony at all. And there's a very good reason for it. It's the after effects of that bombardment. Bellotto had actually left Saxony, probably with the canvases that he'd completed as well. And they were supposed to go to Frederick Augustus, but they didn't. They must have remained for a while in Bellotto's ownership. And mysteriously, they all found their way to England in the 1780s, where there was a ready market for them because, of course, there was this association with Canaletto. This is the Church of the Holy Cross, which has been bombarded. Bellotto is back in Dresden in 1761, and this is one of the things that he finds. The rest of the church is being demolished. Also close by, this is, if you've ever been to Dresden, the most beautiful part of it is the Altstadt, the old town, the old city. This is right in the center of that. And his family home was also there. His family home was obliterated. A lot of his own paintings, a lot of his own drawings, and the collection of books of which he was very proud, all gone. We know he had these things because his inventory came to light quite recently. This is another image that our artist managed to capture. another area of the city completely destroyed. So we're beginning to see really why there's no fan club for Frederick the Great in Dresden or Leipzig. And of course, as one of our group has already observed, that this has a kind of an echo sort of further down history, because there was the terrible raid. I think it was 4 raids, 3 by the RAF and 1 by the American Army Air Force, one night in February 1945. The most shocking thing is that Dresden never been bombed before, and yet all its Baroque beauty, and it was known as the Florence of the Elbe, had gone. Richard Pater, who was a German photographer, hadn't done very well under the Nazis. He'd been a documentary photographer, but they found his views not in tune with theirs, so he had to eke out a living in advertising, but he returns to genuine art after the war, and this has gone down as a masterpiece of photography. It's interesting because, yes, somebody did ask about the Fraunhofer. Was it bombed during the Second World War? And I've already said it was, and then rebuilt much later. Interestingly, that really strong 12,000-ton sandstone dome proved its saving in the Prussian bombardment, because it was something to do with the trajectory of the cannonballs and the curvature of the dome and the strength of the dome. Is all the Prussian cannonballs that hit the Fraunhofer bounced off it, causing minimal damage, which is an interesting observation. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Enough of war. The rest of this, for the last few minutes, will be much more peaceful, I promise you. This is another Manchester work. Unfortunately, I don't have the dimensions, so I'm going to guess that it's roughly half those big canvases of Bellotto's that we have on display at the moment. But it's at the side of the exhibition, and it's there for a very good reason. We acquired this in 2019, courtesy of Inland Revenue. Nicholas Berchem was a Dutch landscape artist. There's a sense in which the Dutch did invent landscape art, and so Bellotto drew from that. When I say drew from it, I meant derived inspiration from it. Yes, he was from Haarlem, which was the home of many landscape artists, but the intriguing thing is this is one of the Italianate landscapes. It's of an imagined Italy, an Italy with the imagination. Nobody knows for certain whether Berchem actually visited Italy. There's sort of proof both ways. In a way, that doesn't matter. But what is significant here, we've talked about the human figures before. Berchem loved including human figures in his own landscapes, and he also had a second string providing human figures for other people's landscapes. Some of the artists that we actually have represented in our own collection. But we know that some of the copies of Berchem's work, not this particularly, were seen by Bellotto. And we know that in some cases, the figures were almost completely transcribed. So that when we're looking at the human figures in Bellotto's work, in a way, we're looking even further back in time, not in every single case. Now, this is from another of the Manchester paintings. I've said that there is this great focus on what Hannah Williamson, the curator, calls staffage, or she says as an alternative northern pronunciation, staffage, the little people, the people who've made history and yet are seldom recorded in it. And you look at this, and I think the beauty of this is that, this is a sort of washing day that I'm sure most of us can remember, the days before tumble dryers. When I say most of us, I shouldn't be so, I shouldn't make that assumption, should I? But the idea of washing out on the line, I mean, that is timeless, isn't it? And we almost feel as though we can eavesdrop on these conversations, don't we? And we wonder what they're gossiping about. And it's not too much of a, we begin to wonder, I think, whether there aren't aspects of humanity that really don't change over the centuries. It's almost as though, you know, we're somehow very closely linked, even though we're distant in time, we're very close to them in another way. Again, this is from that same painting. We'll see the whole thing in a moment. Different groups of peoples belonging to different classes. Some of them have a sense of purpose. Others are simply passing the time of day. It's a long way from any thought of war, quite honestly, isn't it? The people do look carefree. They do look as though they're enjoying life for what it is. Is that a fantasy? Was he making this sort of idyllic in some way? Quite possibly, quite possibly. As for Bellotto himself, well, in 1763, his patron, the Elector of Saxony, died. He'd had a particularly good working relationship with his patron, but by 1765, his stock had fallen. There was a new regime in charge in Dresden. They didn't really care for Bellotto. He was really removed from his position of court painter and offered a teacher of drawing position at a newly found academy or school. He was derided by many people because his command of German wasn't very good indeed. His son, Lorenzo, very often had to translate for him, even when he was teaching at the School of Art in Dresden, which must have been rather irksome for his students. This is interesting because it is a capriccio or a fantasy, because this, even though this is painted in Dresden, it's not of Dresden. The architecture has been identified as belonging to Venice. He's dressed as a Venetian senator. Venice, of course, like Holland was a republic back then. He's gesturing, he's almost inviting us in, isn't he? And we do well to notice these dilapidated posters, because there is one with a quotation in Latin. And that's the quotation: "The power to dare has always belonged to painters and poets." In other words, perhaps what marks out a great artist is that they break the rules, they take risks. And of course, he did travel a great deal. He had a style that did develop. He didn't stay long in the drawing position in Dresden, and I think that was probably intended. There was a new king in Warsaw, Stanislaus, I think it was Stanislaus II. There was also a new empress in Russia, German-born, but empress, probably the most famous of the emperors and empresses of Russia, Catherine the Great. She, very much a child of the Enlightenment, very keen for Bellotto to become the court painter at St. Petersburg. And he sets off for St. Petersburg, but he never reaches it. Why? Because he stays in Warsaw and he becomes a court painter there. Many scenes of Warsaw. Warsaw, like Dresden, suffered dreadful damage during the Second World War for rather different reasons. And it's an oft-told tale that when they came to rebuild the historic center of Warsaw, and I've never been to Warsaw, but it's Renaissance corner particularly, that they took Bellotto's paintings to enable them to do that. And we come back to our two now. We're going to finish on these. Got my glasses off then. We've got the Brunnen house here. We're going to go round to the right of the Brunnenhaus from our side. So we've got the line of the barracks here, and you'll notice that there is a building on the other side of that. And it's that building that we see full on. So we've got our backs to the barracks here. This building, the Magdalenenburg, by this time this had really become a storehouse. And over here we've got the Brunnenhaus again, and where we've been looking in the previous painting is from here. I actually went down to see the exhibition in London in August, and I, like many of you, had seen our two works many times in Manchester. But when I saw them in London, facing one another on fairly adjacent walls, I just wanted to weep. I felt I'd never seen the beauty of those two works and the way they seemed to reflect the beauty of one another. I found profoundly moving, and I didn't actually do this, I hasten to assure you, but every other visitor who came in, I kept wanting to say to them, you know, these two works, they're from Manchester, we've lent them, I'm from Manchester. It was that kind of feeling, a feeling of intense pride. And again, as we've always said, we know that war is coming, but in a way, you can almost imagine that war is never going to come. You know, that we can have that now, moment of the now, being in the now forever. And my final comment is this. I've been listening to Radio 4's Book of the Week, and yesterday I heard a wonderful piece read by the writer Olivia Lang. She's written a great deal about loneliness and the links between loneliness and creativity. And she was one of those people who didn't come out really between the lockdowns. And it was only after the third lockdown that she even thought of visiting a gallery. And she visited the National Gallery. She was very apprehensive at first. And eventually she found herself in front of a Renaissance painting. And she said that that Renaissance painting completely altered her view of time. She said that simply looking at the work that she was looking at gave her a sense of space, a sense of calm, a sense of ease. And she used this phrase, and these were her last words in the piece. She said, there seemed to be abundant time in that work and cloudless centuries of it ahead, as though there's no worry at all. We can always live in this moment of peace and tranquility. Thank you, Paul.